So if you see the slide, usually when we go out for any recreation, we usually see a very majestic landscape. But if you look a bit closely, there are different layers. These alternating layers are basically different lava flows, and I've indicated on the slide is that there are different lava flows. Sometimes it's not easy to differentiate, but over the years of training and observation, it's easier for me to now recognize these features. And there are some telltale features on the ground, like the ropey power flow to the right, which is basically a reddish, slow moving lava. Sometimes people ask me, how does this landscape actually help you to understand how groundwater flows? So for giving an analogy, I usually use these two slides, two pictures. Is basically most people think it's a very flat, layered unit, but it's not. It's not true. If you see, it's a combination of both. It's a flat sometimes, and sometimes they are overlapping each other, just like the second desert that you see there. Is that they are not uniformly spread out, but have different thickness and different units overlap each other. Next, next slide. Yeah, and important thing is while observing this landscape, usually we see a lot of rock types which are actually defines these different flow units. So one being the different basalt also has different variations. If you see to the top right corner, you'll see there are three colored rocks, but all the three rocks have different water holding capacity, different hardness, different weathering degree of weathering, the ability to weather differently. So if you see on the right hand side, the reddish is also basalt, but it's called the rubbly, the flow top breccia, which is basically the lava when it moves forward, the top surface gets brachiated or broken down, and they actually oxidize. So it has that reddish tinge. And if you see in the middle, the yellowish is basically a weathered, oxidizing. I would say when it is exposed to water and air for a longer time, it starts disintegrating. It starts leaching away soluble minerals. And to the extreme left is you see the basalt, which is a hard rock. And this is what usually defines the entire landscape of Maharashtra. Almost 80% of Maharashtra is Deccan basalt. And even in basalt, there are different variations. If you see to the bottom right, there are certain marker horizons we call, which is basically used to classify volcanic eruptions in India. This is called as giant plagioclase basalt. If you see there are different, if you look closely to this image, you will see that there are different crystals of plagioclase. They are basically somehow a late batch of magma that have erupted later on. And even if you see on the bottom left, these brachiated tops or bottoms that I was talking to you about are somehow stitched together by a late zeolite minerals. So basically, it's the water combined with silica minerals have just stitched together all these broken fragments. And there are certain features which are basically from where the lava actually outpours for long distances, and these are called dikes. Where I'm sitting in the picture, if you see on the top left corner, I'm sitting on a dike, which is basically a fissure through which lava actually outpoured. So it is basically cutting across the lava flows that you see. Yeah, and next slide, please. So if I have to slice through a Deccan basalt flow sequence, it looks something like this. It's basically, if you look closely, there are different rock types which define. So compact basalt is basically an impervious hard rock. So usually they stand as something like a capping rock unit. But there are different rocks which I was talking to you about in basalt. There are variations. So these are flow top units, and there are different. You call it as there is a unit between different flow units, which is called as a red bowl, which is basically a paleosoil sometimes. And these different rock types actually define how water sometimes enter or sometimes they discharge because they're impervious, so they will move outside the landscape through coming out as springs or coming out as a stream, joining the stream. So this is basically a cross-sectional of a basaltic flow sequence in Deccan basalt. If you move to the next slide. Having this background, I think it gives fairly good idea about how that the landscape is not flat. Say towards the western side, we have the mountains, which are basically, there are a lot of dikes there, which are actually the fissure or conduits from where the lava flows. And if you move towards the eastern side, you will see the topography gentles out. And on this, we have our landscape where the rivers and streams move. And different landscape actually define how we look at water as something which is surface, not something more of a groundwater. And surface water moves across all different landscapes, and so is groundwater. And so I wanted to share something which I had a very interesting conversation with a native tribe who had come to India for sharing her idea about how water is perceived in the Native Americans. So it's basically a values, right? So it's values where we look at rivers should, I mean, they see rivers as something should be flow. It should not be obstructed. But whereas if you see an engineer, he will look at something like it is a floodway, so we need to, we need to dam it. Also in terms of river, river provides, like it provides fishing, it provides water for irrigation. But something for an engineer, I'm not going critical about engineers, but it's just how we look at resources as through our own discipline, which actually makes it much more difficult for us to manage water. So an engineer would look at something as a reservoir or recreational facility, and not so much of values associated with it. It is more of something use and throw. And also in terms of social is something where in a native tribe, it is more of a common good, whereas in the landscape that we are designing today is something that we are holding it. It's something our resource, say it belongs to the irrigation department, it belongs to a farmer in his well, a lake which is owned by a particular a landlord. So every person has his own different perceptions about how they see water and values associated with it. To the next slide. I think I wanted to stitch here my own personal story here, because in the initial beginning, I was more looking at, since I come from a very, not really connected to water, but it's more of an architecture, geochemistry. But over the years, many of my treks in the Western Ghats actually made me come in close touch with people who live in the mountains. And this is one of the photographs, which actually made me think that I need to change or probably use my skill sets to better or help them better understand, or also understand how they perceive it. So there is a small video. I wanted to show it to you all.
Hi.
So this video was shown just to show how the people in the mountains actually live. and how they relate to the resources are something common where everyone comes together at the same point and use the resource for washing for different purposes, and how we are so disconnected from the resources because it's something which we get, it's a luxury, we get it tapped, so we don't really value it so much as these people value it, because after collecting water in these small vessels, they have to walk upstream, walking up the mountains. And I think many of such experiences actually made me shift to something which is more applied. And that's where I started using my understanding about the landscape architecture or the basaltic architecture to really understand how it can be improved, or at least it can be conserved. Because over the years, in my past decade, I've seen that many of these springs or many of this public water supply are going either there is a shortage or there is hardly any water in these springs, and it's also attributed to a lot of other factors which I will talk about in the following slide. Thanks. So I wanted to come to this slide, which is very important because since I've been asked to talk about how I see or perceive water, but I think over the years, I've realized it's not how much we talk technical that solves the issue. There are a lot of aspects associated with water, right from the social status around the water of communities that are living, the socio-economic conditions, even the engineers, they are stakeholders, how they see it, how say I perceive it. So I wanted to give this example of the story of this elephant and six blind men, who wanted to understand how the elephant really, or what it is actually. So everyone had a different interpretation. And this is how the current understanding also about water is, especially when we are trying to manage water. Because often people have a very, like say, a particular domain expert who is not wrong, who is very important in every domain, but they have a particular training or understanding about how they see things. And I think we have not opened our eyes to really understand this is something very common. It is the same elephant, right? But over the years, people have actually looked at something as a separate thing, like something, for example, an engineer will look at it as a dam, I will look at it as something groundwater, or a social scientist will look at something which is a basic right. So there are a lot of interpretation, understanding about how groundwater or even water as such is seen. I wanted to give this picture because I think this is very relevant in our current management of water, both surface and groundwater, because especially groundwater is something which is invisible, and surface is something it's visible, so it's easy to manage. We can open the floodgates, we can release the water, or we can dam it. So these things are much more of a centralized way. But if you look at water as such, water is something very common to everyone. It is not for a particular landscape. It runs through right where it falls, right at the ridge, the mountains where it falls, all the way it reaches the sea. Is something it moves through different landscape, different aquifer systems, different social societies, and then and how we use it is all a personal thing. But I personally feel it's how we look at the elephant or the water as a common thing is very important to addressing this issue. So can we move to the next slide? Often people in the villages or in communities where I go and work, and also city dwellers, they think they drill a bore well. They say, hey, we have identified a spot. We know there is water, and we're going to get this many liter per second water, this many liters of water. So, but in reality, groundwater is not something abundant in our landscape. It's very meager. Surely during monsoon, we feel there is no shortage. But if you actually look at the architecture, that's why I wanted to show this photograph where different rock units, if you see on the right side, I've given a legend where different rock types actually have different way to hold water and transmit water. And if you see in this photograph, water is not something very uniformly saturated. It is going through certain cracks and crevices. And this is how groundwater moves. And we are actually tapping into these veins. So understanding of this basaltic units, their morphology, their structure really aids in understanding how water moves, especially during like a road section, or if we're drilling, we really come to know how water, or at what depth water is struck. But this is basically to give an idea. Water is not something very uniformly saturated. The lava flow, which I was talking to you about earlier, it is not uniform. They are overlapping, and the water has a very preferential way of moving through different lava units or through cracks and crevices. Next slide, please. Yeah, so to really start from the mountain, where I've been working for almost a decade, is basically working with these communities, and where water is something, I mean, people often say Western Ghats receives a lot of water, so there shouldn't be a shortage of water, but it's the other way around. There's a huge shortage of water because water is not equally accessible for everyone, and the understanding, the values associated for them with water is something which is common. But over the years, how technology has intruded into the landscape, we are all looking at water as something which, something very personal, which is not. If you see, there are different aspects which we are also losing. In the Western Ghats, we see there are a traditional diversion-based irrigation system which has been for many hundreds of years, and also these irrigation systems, which is basically a diversion along the slopes, they run down, and they have two purposes. One, to irrigate the land below, and also on the way, they also recharge different flow units as they move. And they have carved out such furrows along the sides where water moves down. And also, water for smaller communities is through these video that I was showing you earlier about, is that through cracks and crevices or these joints or these contact zones where water moves out in very small amounts. Like in a day, you could fill up, say, 5 vessels or 5 hundas of water. Something that speed is at which the water moves in the ground. Next slide. Yeah. Here I wanted to show something also important aspect which moving in the landscape is very interesting, or to learn something from nature itself, because a lot of theoretical understanding it's been taught to, even from my field, is that something water is moves through certain aspects. But how do we see this? So I wanted to show this. This is a small stream, rather, where they have ascribed a religious value or some sacred space for this landscape, because there is kind of a sacred grove. I just want to run this video because the aim to show this video is also that water is not easily visible, but just when you go downstream where there is a crevice or an opening, you see the water is just oozing out or just running down through cracks. The reason I documented this spring site is also to show that if you when I was panning the video, upstream you can't see any water flow, but it's something which emerges right from the ground. And right here, there are a very specified practice systems running through the landscape. And this video was taken during May. So, and this is towards the Western Ghats. So often people see something water as which grows like flows over the ground, and in summer we don't have water. But there are certain areas which does hold water and does transmit water further downstream. Next slide. Here, I really wanted to give a little bit of, I would say, a theory, but I think this is something which also I've come across in the field quite often. Is just during my aquifer mapping study, basically to understand which rock types hold water and which do not. So while studying even the streams as we move down the slope, is that certain side banks or the riparian zones or the rocks which are adjoining or on the banks of the river or the stream actually also are certain kind of aquifer, which sometimes during summer they actually feed water into the stream rather than we seeing dry riverbeds say during summer. Is that because there is hardly any water, but sometimes water comes along the slopes and then they provide discharge into these streams. Why I wanted to give this little background is because we always look at some stream as something which is flowing, meandering, but we don't see the interaction as much because when we are talking about stream restoration or even riparian restoration, we hardly look at certain areas of where actually aquifers do contribute to the stream flow. And they have an important role. So this is a schematic section which there are different, I would say, scenarios where groundwater or the aquifers from, the groundwater from the aquifer is feeding into the stream, which is basically gaining. And sometimes when the water table dips down in the aquifer, so whenever the stream is flowing, it actually feeds below into the water table. And there are sometimes it's not really connected, say the stream and the groundwater because of certain aquifer medium. And then there is something which is what is moving right through across the aquifer and the stream. So these areas are very important to identify while actually understanding how water moves the landscape and also for further certain vegetation growth that we want to recommend. Yeah. So on the next slide. So this is a typical example. This is from the gaining stream on the left-hand side that you see is basically from Ahmednagar, Aurangabad, and onto the right is also from Aurangabad, central Aurangabad. But if you see there are both are in summer, but certain features are quite, the properties that you see because of the aquifers is that to the right, the stream is dry, but the whatever water was held up in these alluvial stream bed is actually now moving down into the shallow aquifer. So the water table is dipping, whereas in the left-hand side, the rocks or the aquifers on the sides of the stream are actually still holding water and slowly releasing into the stream. So that's why there is, even in May time, there is water still held in this stream. So in semi-arid, which is basically the plainer regions, the farming communities, where rainfall is quite less, now we are moving to the central or mid-central region, where we see that water here is not something which is uniformly distributed as well. Here also communities have to, the same situation where they have to go inside the crevice, hold water. But sometimes understanding how different rock types hold water can help in planning where to do certain interventions. And this is where the understanding of the architecture of the land basaltic sequence does come very handy to understand where water moves out and where might be other potential areas where water might be discharging as springs. So this cross section is of a site in Ahmednagar, quite close to Sangamner. If we see that there are two springs, the two photos are actually depicting the same cross section. If you see one on the where it shows perennial non-artisan contact spring outlet one is the one with the photograph on to the right, where communities have to sit the whole day, collect water, and if you see even there are kids, so they are skipping schools because this is something which we often say education for all, so they will have all the access to basic facility, but it's not true. They also have to spend quite a few time, the whole day I would say, around such spring outlets. And and to the left hand side is on the left hand side photograph is a lower elevation spring, but there is not much water, but it is used by a different community, a smaller, I would say a smaller group of families. But this is how semi-arid hydrology is also. And on top of it, in this region, the next slide, we are seeing like a boom. I mean, I would say it's from 1990s that we are seeing a lot of borewells that have been sunk, and that's changing a lot of groundwater hydrology. And unknowingly, sometimes also that we see that sinking such borewells actually inhibits certain groundwater flows downstream and affecting traditional old spring boxes or even water outlets which communities use. So there's a huge pressure across Maharashtra now, especially I would say most of India where water is groundwater is heavily used for both irrigation and there is hardly water left for drinking. So this is just a cross section from one of the sites from Western Ghats again, where I wanted to show that we had I would say legal litigation because the community actually there didn't have any proof, so we had to actually document all this what is happening by monitoring the discharge and mapping the aquifers and then providing this as a proof for the legal battle because the resort owner wanted to build a huge I mean, he wanted to build a lot of houses there without really understanding that this downstream spring is used by communities for many generations. Next slide. Yeah, and especially when we look at stream, we often see something which is like flowing, free flowing, but that's also not true. There's a lot of issues in rural areas that we see is that in terms of encroachment of stream channels, like you see on the left top left corner photograph, you see there is a channel with there is a small dam, then cement dam, but there is an encroachment for like a farmer has literally encroached the stream channel. And on the right hand side, the top right, we also see a lot of big land owners are actually leveling the land and scouring the mountains. So it's changing a lot of the natural groundwater hydrology, the natural pathway. And I'm sure many people have been hearing about the desilting of streams where widening and deepening is happening quite a lot through the central scheme, basically. But they are done so unscientifically that what they are doing is they're deepening so like they're digging the or deepening the stream so deep that you're almost striking the groundwater from the aquifer. So it's not the natural water which has been flowing from the stream, but it's the groundwater which is being exposed along these streams which have been widened, like the stream banks, the riparian zone is completely destroyed. And there is a lot of stream banks are, because of these widening and deepening, the stream banks are very unstable. So then due to this process, there is a lot of soil also being carried down, which is very important for any landscape. Like when we talk about water, soil is also important. So this soil is also being carried out. Next slide. I wanted to really come to an important aspect because we, when looking at a hydrogeologist, we always look at water with interaction with rock. But that's not true. We have to look at in totality, right from the atmosphere, right when the water falls through rain, like via rain, and then entering the landscape, flowing over the surface, and then being transpired back through certain trees and plants. We did this exercise of to understand really the response of certain vegetation, and this is towards again Western Ghats. But this graph actually shows this is 3 years back that we did for almost for 3 years. But I just wanted to give a slice of what the study was about. Is that we monitored a spring discharge for 24 hours, right from midnight to the next midnight. So what we realized is the discharge during the night increases significantly, and during the afternoon around 2 o'clock, we see that the discharge in the springs reduces. And this is directly indicating that there is water held back in the tree trunk, and they are transpiring. So this is very important when we also look at streams or say mountains or lakes, where when we are trying to understand that not all trees can be planted as we want, because certain trees has certain excessive water use, like we have seen eucalyptus being planted even in semi-arid, actually, unfortunately, and that water is being used and there is hardly water for drinking. So certain trees actually hold water in their trunk, and to give a really good example, we see a lot of old springs or old wells are close to peepal tree or the ficus tree. So these trees actually hold water in their barks, and this water which is held in flux doesn't allow water to just like if you take out all the trees, then the water will just move down the rock units, and they will. I mean, over time we won't have water. But trees have an important role, which is basically to hold the water in the in somewhere in like a upper shelf where water is held back, and they also transpire, and also in terms of giving water downstream. So this was a exercise we did just to give an idea that certain trees and certain plants also have an important role, and what kind of trees, because we can't just plant all whatever we feel like in terms of aesthetics. So can we move to the next slide? I see a lot of questions popping up, so I'll answer them at the end. And the other important aspect is in terms of water quality. When we're talking about water availability, we also need to understand quality, because quality plays a big role, not just in terms of because we need water, clean water, but also certain trees, certain plants can only survive if there are right amount of nutrients or exchange that happens. So along the stream, right from the ridge to the valley, we do this exercise of understanding different water quality parameters, and certain parameters also tell you how long, say, a water is residing, whether it's fresh water, which has a TDS, or a salinity which is 40, 60, to groundwater, deeper groundwater, which is like 500, 700 salinity TDS, which also shows a lot about how long that water has been residing in the aquifers. So water quality gives a big or gives a very good understanding about how different rock units, aquifers, the vegetation enhance water quality, and also over time, when there is excessive pumping, also there is a lot of salinity which increases over time. Next slide. The other important thing which is in terms of water availability in stream and aquifers is the climate change that's happening, and massive changes that we are seeing in the landscape, right from we are actually blowing up and cutting across certain mountains, and without even understanding what's the value it holds. Because, for example, in the Western Ghats, you might have heard Tada, or the plateau, the lateritic plateau. Often people say it's a wasteland, it doesn't have any value, but these lateritic rocks which cap these Western Ghats mountains actually are like a water tower. They are like sponge. They hold water and they slowly release. They are like good aquifers which are sitting right on top. They are water buckets. But when planners come in, they say there is no value to it because there is nothing grows on it. There is hardly any. I mean, water doesn't flow during summer. So what is the use? We can mine, say, laterite or say bauxite, so that we can use it. So it's very short-term understanding about certain landscape, And this study that we are doing in one of the villages in Sangamner, it's basically I studied this for 5 years and see how certain land use practices, right from in semi-arid, this is very unfortunate. Semi-arid region is also the areas where there are a lot of sugarcane factories, and which is hardly hold water in that region, or there's hardly rainfall. Still, we see a lot of pressure from the in terms of water use, and that also affects how water is held back over time, or what is available for the next season or for drinking water. So this 5-year timeline, which I wanted to show about a village, is in terms of how water has been changing. Like 2012 was a drought year, and we could see quite distinctly that in the summer water table dipped quite low, and communities which use certain wells for drinking, they didn't have water. So these landscape studies or these village-wise studies also gives a good insight about what practices which are being pushed by the government to use certain kind of schemes like farm pond. Farm pond is being set up in such places, and there is hardly any rainfall. So communities are switching to bore wells, and from bore well they're pumping out water and collecting water into these structures. So defeats the purpose of really fighting against climate change, because when there is a lot of climate variability, the safe thing is water is underground. So I just wanted to give this idea, just that a lot of things happening and a lot of monitoring needs to be happening across, I would say, India, but there are very few data points, and we took this village-wise village perspective is just because we collaborated with the farmers. We asked them to collect information regularly, so this could be developed. Otherwise, there is one data monitoring point for a tehsil or 2 or 3, and that doesn't really tell you what is happening in a village. So this study is basically to highlight why we need more data points. Next slide. So this slide basically summarizes how we look at water, both surface and groundwater, as something which we can own, we can stock, but nothing as something which flows and which is common. And I mean, all these slides basically shows how I would say how humans have become greedy. But if you go back, if you look at smaller communities, the understanding of water is something which is common, and newer technologies have just shifted our value system, how we look at resources as something mine, or it's that my land, my water. It's not that water is for everyone. Like when rain falls on every landscape. Surely there is some variability, but this just summarizes how we are using water in the farming areas, and also urban. That's nothing different. Next slide. This slide, actually, I wanted to emphasize in terms of biodiversity, because for the past 5 years, I've been also looking at how biodiversity is sustained and how certain functions and services by the biodiversity enhances water quality. There are a lot of things that happens in terms of, say, a fish eats algae in the stream. There are a lot of, say, proxy indicators, like a water strider will give certain understanding of the water quality in a region. So there are a lot of things that is happening, and it all depends how certain landscape holds certain biodiversity. These are biodiversity which is visible like through naked eye, but there is also finer micro biodiversity which we in India have not looked at, which is this microfaunas, which also has a great role in terms of purifying water, eating away certain heavy metals, or certain in maintaining basically the balance of water. So this is only function, or these services or these functions are only it works when there is rich biodiversity around certain like springs or streams. Otherwise, what we have been putting is just the pollutants, without even understanding how these biodiversity has a greater role in purifying, in maintaining the balance, and also maintaining nutrients. Because sometimes we see in agrarian landscape, we see a lot of pesticides and fertilizers we use. There is a lot of nitrogen that is being used. So that over time creates a lot of algae in the stream. So a lot of functions, I mean, I would say these are free services that we have along the stream, but we are not documenting enough, we are not doing it enough. And there's not much interest because we still look at water as something anthropocentric, not ecocentric. So I just wanted to show that the slide is what all biodiversity have been seeing over for the past 5 years. Next slide. Often people say, okay, you are a scientist, you are telling things to do, but people are not going to listen. So what do you do? So I've been using certain tools, basically how people perceive both surface and subsurface landscape through certain tools, through something which they can understand, they start building together. So we have this participatory 3D visualization where people build their own surface topography through cardboards or different ways that you can use. Nowadays, there are surely 3D printers, but surely that doesn't give that connect because during this process, there is a lot of communication that happens between communities from different castes, different social groups, and also importantly, if you see, there are men and women also have a different perceptions about water. And over the years, I've seen women have a better understanding about water than men do because men have been looking at water as something as for irrigation, and they have been telling me कि पानी असेल तर we can do sheti, that we don't care about water. But when I hear women talking, they talk about both. They talk about drinking because they are the ones who travel at distance, collect water, and they do a lot of other things which men folk usually tend to ignore or tend to not see. So there are different tools that I use to communicate my findings. Say a study that I've done, I put it across on the landscape. I ask them to put their understanding about what certain resources are available on that map, and then try to put my study findings. So when there is a convergence, people then try to make connect. Okay, they say कि certain kind of land use practice of farming is actually creating local groundwater drawdown where there is hardly any water for drinking. So this connect is where, as a scientist, where I have to provide this information, not just publishing papers, but the point is here we go down to the level in their local language, talk in their own terms rather than using some hefty jargon words, but making them understand. And they have an interesting vocabulary of certain aspects of the landscape, which I find very interesting, and that I use it to communicate. So on the right, bottom right is a P3DM model of one is the landscape, and on the left hand side is the groundwater model. So when people look at how certain landscape is being, I mean, how they're using a landscape vis-a-vis with the groundwater table, it really gives them an idea that, for example, a certain group of farmers said that there are a lot of bore wells and dug wells being dug in a certain areas, which is creating that. So we should respect. So they come up with these solutions rather than I telling them. So I'm just providing or bridging that gap, and so they can actually come up with ideas or some kind of understanding where they make a decision at the panchayat level. Next. Yeah, so this is a live slide. I think this exercise is something very iterative, which I do, which we call in our term is science communication, but going out to them, talking to them repeatedly. Because just imagine we are trying to, it's not about I educating them, it's both ways, because I also get to know how they understand the landscape and how they make decisions during these meetings. So all these meetings that I have with communities, it I won't say it has been all successful, but I would say at least 10% has helped communities to make the decision which is in favor of the common resource, and that's what is important because communities also coming up with the idea of common farming, which over the years we have been seeing everyone is doing individual farming, but how collective farming and collective use of resources can also help or provide you the same yield of productivity say in your land from your landscape. I think this is the last slide. So I will just stop here, and if anyone has any questions, I can take them later, or I don't know when. I leave it to the.
Yes, thank you, Rennie. Awesome, very insightful. from technically sound to, this common knowledge resource is so much water is everybody's business, we say. And the presentation was really insightful. The elephant image, it stays back with us. And I'm sure the next speaker, Varsha ma'am, we will be taking the questions afterwards. We have a lot of them popping in, but we will do that in the later part. So the next talk is about, after the geologist perspective, it was a very holistic view, but the next talk is about designing along water. And for a landscape architect, it is a very what do you call it? It is that elephant that we try to bring in together and join the pieces and come up with the complete picture. So the challenges are there are a lot of challenges in that. So Varsha ma'am is a very well-known name on this platform, yet there might be speakers from other domain for whom I'll be doing a formal introduction. She's like a guru to all of us. But for the rest of it who may not know, Varsha ma'am is a renowned landscape architect practicing in Pune. Her firm, Ravi and Varsha Gawande Architects, represents many award-winning projects. Her love for landscape architecture can be seen through her work. Other than being a practitioner, she has been actively involved in academics for over 20 plus years. She has been served the chair of the Vice President of Indian Society of Landscape Architects in 2011-12. So a mentor for many students of landscape architecture. And we are here to hear, as usual, excited to hear more from her. Welcome, Varsha ma'am.
First of all, thank you, ISOLA Maharashtra chapter, for giving me this opportunity. And that was really a wonderful presentation by Reni. I think it was a very holistic way of looking at water and looking at landscape from the lens of water. What I'm going to do is actually zoom in, and I'm going to talk more about water as a design element and different qualities for which, we all designers love to use water in our work. I mean, when I say designers, it's not only landscape designers, it's artists, installation artists, it's architects. Everyone loves to use water in their project, and I'm going to talk about the special qualities of water for which we all love to use it in our works. So one of the qualities I feel that makes it so popular in designers is its transformation with movement. So what you see in this slide is still colorless, mirror-like water, which is quiet and contemplative. With little movement, it starts creating patterns. And needless to say, because I actually wanted to add audio clips also, but not being so tech savvy, I couldn't do that. But I think all creative minds here can imagine how the music of water slowly starts with movement in water. Some more movement, and then it becomes opaque and it starts getting a form for itself. And then turbulent, frothy, white water, which is an object in itself. So, and this brings a lot of energy to the space around. So this transformation of water with movement, it not only transforms the space around visually, but it also transforms the space physically and emotionally. And I think this is one quality that all designers really, really appreciate. So what I have tried to do is generally there are pictures which are borrowed pictures, either from others' projects or from nature. And then there are pictures, some of the pictures are from our works. I will not talk specifically about those works, but I think the inspirations are basically from nature and from other works. The other quality which makes it different from rest of the natural elements is basically its ability to exist in different states. So what you see in this picture is a liquid state of water which can easily be contained. Then there is gaseous state of water which can easily disperse, and it makes the space more mysterious. Then the solid state, we in our climate cannot really use this state of water in our design. But in solid state, it becomes a form in itself. It becomes an object in itself. So this is another quality which makes water really, really different from rest of the elements. Third quality, I feel very important quality in water is that the way it changes its visual quality depending upon how the light falls on it. So there is sparkling water, there is shimmering water, there is a rainbow in the mist, there's reflection because of the kind of light that falls in that water. So, and all these qualities can be taken advantage of in design, or while designing, we can keep these in mind and be more sensitive about use of water in our designs. So undoubtedly, with all these unique qualities, water is one of the most evocative and energizing and powerful medium of design. It is very versatile, but it is at the same time very, very challenging to use. And to explain the power of this medium, no words are better than Lao Tse's words, which say, "Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, yet for dissolving the hard and the inflexible, nothing can surpass it." So we all know that historically, people have found ways and means to control it, to contain it for various reasons. What you see on the left-hand side is to give access, for cleansing, for nourishment, for protection, for cooling, or for climatic control, for reflection, for entertainment, as a collector, as a connector, as a metaphor, or as a symbol. So there are many ways in which water has already been used historically, and this is a great, studying these examples is a great way of learning how water can be used in designs. Here are some contemporary examples, our attempts at using, learning from history, or using these ways of containing and controlling water in design. So to give access to the stream, you have the age-articulated, rainwater harvested, brought in through this channel and harvested in a pond, then a moat around the seating area, which kind of gives separate identity to the seating, and then water as a connector. For its reflective quality, for entertainment, use of various mediums to contain water, because that's another quality that it takes the shape of the container, or even the color changes as per the color of the container. As a connector, so the whole landscape revolves around water and multi-purpose water channel, which symbolically connects one element with the other. And it also carries storm water to be stored and harvested in a pond at the lowermost point. So as a linear element, along which, so space being linear, as a linear element along which the entire development, so the focus of the development, one can say. As a sculpture, so basically here the water is like, it's a surface, water is just a surface. So it's a bowl and a cone, and the form itself is sculptural, and water just gives a different texture to that particular surface. And as a metaphor, So basically, this is about one's journey in life, and at lowermost point, what we have is use of playful use of water, which symbolizes youth. As you go along, it becomes quieter and it becomes contemplative towards the end at the uppermost area. So, water as a metaphor. Here, I would like to discuss two projects very briefly, which are very close to my heart for their use in water. This is a project by famous designer Maya Lin, and it is a civil rights memorial in Alabama. This memorial is about people's lives. Maya Lin, the designer, when she got this assignment, read Martin Luther King's speeches. And one of the passages from his speech inspired her to use water as an important part of the memorial. One can see that passage inscribed on that wall. So basically, this memorial consists of basic two minimal but majestic forms of black granite. One is a curved wall behind as a backdrop, and one is an elliptical table. On the elliptical table are inscribed important events and names of the martyrs. Water bubbles from the source that is off-center and uniformly covers the table. There is quiet and constant presence of water on the table. On the edge, it wraps around the underside and then drops down near the base. So as people walk around the periphery to read what is inscribed, water encourages them to touch the inscriptions through water. It creates gentle ripples, and the designer herself puts it, water moves non-violently, just as the activists participated in the Civil War movement, fixed yet fluid. The controlled power of water moving over granite conveys invincibility. There is another interesting statement by Maya Lin about her experience at this memorial. She says that one of the martyrs' mother was touching his name beneath the water and crying. And I realized that tears were becoming part of the memorial. So very, very sensitive use of water. Water doesn't have to be always playful, but with very little, very thoughtful, but very little intervention, one can use water in a very, very effective manner. This is another project that I would like to talk about. It is by Tadao Ando. So Tadao Ando, everyone knows, and all are Tadao Ando, for those who are not architects or landscape architects. He is a very famous architect, Japanese architect, and his use of water in architecture is very well known with his with one of the most important examples, that is Water Temple. This project is not very highly published, but we had the opportunity to visit this place, and I thought that it deserves more mention. So this is nothing but this is called as Garden of Fine Arts, and it is a display of 8 selected world famous paintings, which are kind of basically recreated in porcelain panels. So what you see numbered as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, those are the places where these paintings are located very, very carefully and very thoughtfully. The entire place, the entire site, it's a linear site, and the entire site is a shallow water body at different levels. And there is a ramp that takes you to these different levels. And while you are moving, you encounter these paintings. So what is unique about this particular project is that water here, so for example, on the left-hand side, the water lily is below water, the painting of water lily is below water. There are some famous paintings for which the water either becomes a barrier, like a moat, or it becomes a foreground, it becomes a setting. So water or it becomes music, so there is falling water for some of the paintings as a foreground or as a background. So actually water is used for various qualities along with these paintings, and that whole thing becomes, so one cannot really imagine this garden of fine arts without water. So lately, water is not only looked at as a visual element, but lately we designers also have started looking at water as a resource. And here again, I would like to mention the works of Konjian Yu, because according to me, he is one of the trendsetters in use of water, or designing along water. Some of his famous examples, all of us know about his famous examples, so I will not get into the details of these examples. But one is a floating garden along Yonging River Park, and the other is a Red Ribbon, which was, I think, first of its kind in China. And we again had the opportunity to visit these places and experience for ourselves what design intervention can do to the whole experience of water, flowing water, or water, stagnated water also. So these are the projects where water is not only treated as a visual element, but this is where water is treated as a resource, and that is the trend. So most of the designers today, landscape designers today, are not looking at water only as a visual element, or element to enhance the physical or emotional quality of space, but they're looking at it also as one of the very important aspects of entire system, the landscape system. And so here are some of our attempts to look at water in a little different perspective. We as landscape architects are trying to integrate these ecological principles very creatively in our designs, but I must admit that it is still at a very nascent stage, and there is a lot more to learn from people like Reni, or maybe associate with people like Reni and learn about the deep waters also. So on the left-hand side is a reed bed to kind of improve the quality of treated STP water. There's a bio pond, there is a polishing pond, all in one project itself. A project in arid climate where all depressions in the site which were created because of surface mining are conceived as seasonal wetlands, along with the stream which was channelized, so stream that is proposed to be brought back to natural shape, and to allow it to interact more with the surrounding land and develop its own system. Again, a few rainwater holding ponds with a living system. I mean, ponds as a living system in some of the projects. Then surface water as a theme for the entire project. So the project is held by this stream or a bioswale which passes through the entire length of the project, then terminates into a polishing pond, and then to a quarry. So on the right-hand side, what you see is a swell in dry season and the swell in monsoon. And this is the end point where it actually pours water or stores water. So basically, I would say that there are different ways of looking at water as a design element. There has been a shift in the way we have started looking at water, not only as aesthetical element. Of course, that at the same time cannot be underestimated. It has a very, very important role to play as an aesthetical element for its physical qualities, for climatic control. But at the same time, I think it's very, very important today to respect and recognize it as a very valuable resource. Thank you.
That was so beautiful. And it truly celebrates water. Nice presentation, ma'am. Thank you so much. I think like the water, both the presentations really aroused the very, kind of emotive element of dynamically very different entities and qualities of water. The first one really created ripples in our minds, and the second one has brought a lot of peace. Uh, so thank you both of you all.
Ma'am, thank you, Rini, for the presentation. So now we'll take the questions. So the first question was from Aditi to Rini. So Aditi, can you please unmute yourself and ask the question?
Thanks, Rani. Aditi here. I really liked your presentation in terms of the thought process, the journey of thought process that you've sort of gone through to come where you are right now. So what I wanted to ask is a little it's a little very debated topic, but it's something that has been playing on in my head. What is your views on the river connection project, which the recent one which is being discussed is the Kane Betwa one? So I would really like to know. Thank you.
Right. I personally, if you ask me 10 years back, I would have said yes, because I've been very fresh from, say, theoretical background. But what I've seen is over the years, there are a lot of implications of connections or connecting riverbeds, because one being in terms of we are looking at say a dry region to be flowing with water because of the connection, and that changes a lot of not just in terms of the flow, but also in terms of how certain landscape respond, or certain vegetation has grown or adapted to certain landscape or drier region for some time. So, and the other being is also biodiversity, where a lot of people talk about, because certain biodiversity are very specific for certain region, and that creates a lot of other changes that happen in the landscape in terms of nutrient exchange, nutrient dissolving. So not much study has been done. Although if we really want to connect certain stream or riverbed, there has to be done a proper pilot. And right now, whatever I've seen certain pilots is just because we are all driven by human needs, but not looking at the other voices of, for example, the ecosystem functions of a riverbed, or even looking at in terms of what will happen if there is a extreme event. Will that stream actually cater to taking the heavy flood water? I think these all the aspects need to be really thought through and really studied. Right now, we are just driven by quick, what we call solving the issues for short term. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Rini.
Yeah, thank you, Rini. So the next question is from Avdut Kumthekar.
Yeah, I'm Anjali Kumthekar. Avdut is not here at the moment, but I would love to ask this question on his behalf. Yeah. Rini, it was a very insightful presentation, and a question in mind probably would help many of us. There are many ways to technically understand the water table levels when we begin with a project, a landscape project. Yeah, but how could it be analyzed visually? Because there are certain sites which are smaller in size, and this technically it is not possible to quickly get the water table information. So how could it be analyzed visually? What are the indicators on surface landscape?
Right. Surely, I mean, I won't say we always need some water level. There are other methods as well, and one being the vegetation. Certain trees or certain species of trees, when they are aligned along a certain show some kind of a flow, direction, it also gives a lot of idea about what might be below. Because there has been way back some studies or literature that I have read, which no one has followed up, is that ficus tree or umbarsa jhad, which is basically the trees are the roots of the trees are deep rooted, and they also sometimes open up cracks and crevices, and they try to tap into whatever moisture is there, the tips. And these trees actually also tell you a lot of about, say, the flow direction. And there has been study, the inclination of the tree, how a certain fig tree is inclined, how the canopy is. But somehow it has not been systematically analyzed at different places. So it is just a one pilot study, and then it is not what you call rigorously tested out in all areas. And what I have seen is most of the freshwater sources, they have fig trees or people tree or even jamun tree. So I think all
Yes.
these trees have certain way of tapping water and how they relate to the rocks. Because if you see, it is a hard rock. It is not easy for roots to crack open. But over time, certain trees do have that biological intervention that happens, that they open up a crack or crevice just by the root strength over the time. So I think nowadays there are satellite images which also helps you to identify certain areas, especially for a broader region. But for a very small plot, if I would say, because I do also such small areas where there are people who own certain land and they want to understand. So I have to actually ask the client to drill a pilot small well, which is not very deep, but at least it gives you an idea about how the water table is responding, especially where there is no vegetation. But there is nowadays this NDWI, which is you use satellite images to identify certain pockets or zones where water might be there just by analyzing the satellite images.
Okay. Yes. Thank you, Rini.
Yeah, welcome.
The next question is from Anushri.
I can read her question here. So,
Yeah.
yeah. In terms of, I just read through if she's not there, because what she asks is whether what is the best way to recharge groundwater, because her understanding, or she has read that it sometimes recharging can pollute the groundwater, and also a lot of wastewater is managed through soak pits, reed beds, wetlands. There are chances of interaction with the groundwater. How can common person assess this? I think that's true. Sometimes what we are seeing nowadays in these broad regional scale recharge processes, that we are not really understanding how the natural processes work. Because over time, people have been just putting surface runoff into bore wells or dug wells. And I've seen many of the bore wells are being clogged with spine silt, and they become dysfunctional over time. So basically, there needs to be a proper way to, if you're going to put, what kind of water you're going to put. Because if you're also talking about wastewater, surely wastewater also contaminates. If a water source is very close to a wastewater body or anything which is contaminated, it surely will contaminate the groundwater. So we need to understand where it needs to be placed, what kind of processes needs to happen before it enters the ground, because we can't put all the water inside. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Rini. So the next question is from Satwan Gandhi. So,
Yeah,
so what
sure.
are the possibilities for dry land? The land is very much healthy during the monsoon and winter, but in summer it is totally like as similar as dry land, lot of cracks during the summer. Um, Even surrounded wells are getting empty because of inadequate water recharge. So basically, he's talking about the dry land in summers.
Yeah, but what are the possibilities? I feel I don't know whether I've captured it right, but if what I understand is in dry land, surely it's a season and we need to accept and respect dry seasons. But in terms of recharging, we have to look at where we can do. We cannot just randomly recharge everywhere, because certain, spatially also, if you look at certain rock types soak in water faster and some don't. So there is this percolation test that we do before even suggesting which site is suitable for recharging.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is from Ketki. So I'll just read it out. The
Yeah.
question: does the vesular basalt rock have same strength as the fine grained basalt rock?
Okay, the simple answer is no. it doesn't have it doesn't show the same strength because vesicula are more porous, slightly more porous and with vesicles, whereas a fine grain doesn't have any vesicles. So it's easier to break a vesicle versus
Atharva has raised his hand. Atharva, can you go ahead?
Basically, I wanted to ask if the rainwater harvesting systems on the ports of Maharashtra, because they are in this basaltic region, are they documented?
In port region, there have been documented. Certain colleges in Pune have been doing it, and they have been understanding why they made it in the first place. So there has been a study. If I'm not wrong, one of my juniors did do his master thesis on ports. So if you go to Ferguson College, surely you will be able to access that information.
Is it possible to revive those?
Yes, it is possible to revive those. But if you see, even our ports are not maintained because although there are ASI, but hardly there are any officials there. The young generations don't really think about water bodies or these ponds or these artificial ponds that are made for storing water, but they also throw in a lot of waste. So I think it is more. I would, to be honest, I feel there is surely there is a possibility, but I think all these youngsters need to come together and basically understand, or this information needs to be passed on, like how ports need to be maintained.
Oh, okay. Thank you. So the next question is from Mugdha.
Hi, Rennie. Hi, I'm just curious to know if you are also involved in urban level developments in cities, major cities in Maharashtra like Pune and Mumbai, wherein I think urban developments are majorly contributing to the change in geology or maybe the land which is there, the natural terrain of the land. We are going deeper for basements and parking requirements. So in that case, if there are any projects that you're working on or you're giving your expertise in urban master planning projects or large scale residential developments.
Right. Surely. I mean, I've been involved in Pune. I mean, since I'm staying in Pune, I've been involved in some way or the other.
Okay.
But also I'm closely now working with IISER, Indian Institute of Science and Education and Research, and also with Pune Knowledge Cluster, which is basically set up by the Principal Secretary on how to make Pune. There are a lot of aspects in terms of urban design,
Exactly,
in terms of transport, water. So I think I'm also involved there in terms of providing that information or how groundwater and surface hydrology needs to be maintained and managed. And in that case, we are trying to develop a dashboard or in terms of a pool of information where I feel it is not just about, say, a hydrogeologist like me, but also landscape architects, social scientists, all people actually contribute to that dashboard. And that is reviewed and properly, and that is actually used by not just, say, urban societies, but also, say, industries which are like the MIDCs, which can also use that information. Right now, if a MIDC or any society has to do anything, it is done basically individually, and they have to call an expert. But if that all information is pooled on a common platform, that can be used. So definitely, I'm also involved in urban in some way or the other. Yes.
Okay, that's great.
Thanks for the insightful presentation, sir. Educating oneself, everyone does, but educating the mass and contributing to the concern of water issues, only few do. It is wonderful way to make a contribution towards bettering the environment in the era of climate change. So it's a appreciation comment.
Yeah, okay.
So the next question is from Saumitra.
Mr. Rennie, I just wanted your comment because recently we have been listening that many cities, which are coastal cities, like Jakarta, who is shifting its capital now, Indonesia. So it is going almost 1400 kilometers away because of the sea level is getting higher and higher. Okay, and that is, they say that because of the groundwater extraction in uniform or extra, or we don't know. How does it relate to? That is what I want to understand.
Yeah, so groundwater is fresh water, right? Like when you say it is not saline. So when fresh water is pulled out from the ground, it is replaced by saline or seawater. So what is happening is this change or this drastic change, especially in Jakarta, what is happening is there are a lot of landslides which are happening, or there are subsidence where because of excessive groundwater pull by a lot of communities, it's where it's creating a void. And when sea level rises, it takes the place, and then the salts and everything, they interact with the underground, and they start shrinking, especially when there is this period of dryness, or when there is increase. So basically, Jakarta is actually sinking city, I would say. And there are not just Jakarta, but also other places in the world. I mean, the Netherlands government is in a big way trying to help Indonesia to put up these levees or these walls, but that is a short-term thing, because over the long term, the landscape, especially where Jakarta is, that landscape is again volcanic. There are a lot of ash deposits in between, which is from volcanic, and they are more clayey, they crack, so they subside over time. So I think this is the reason for Jakarta's sinking, basically. And there are also other cities, if I'm not wrong.
So does it actually increase the runoff to the sea because of that? Then the sea level, why? I have not still understood why the sea level increases, or the city sinks. I don't know what is happening.
So the seawater actually replaces the fresh water, because now if there is a void of fresh water, there is some a process called where it's very simple. Like when even in our oceans, when there is this cold current and hot current, in a similar way, also in terms of salinity. Even now, for example, in Sindhudurg, where I'm working, there are pockets where, although this village is, say, 1 or 2 kilometers away, but there are certain areas along the stream where seawater is intruding, because there is a lot of pull for groundwater pull from these landscapes, and then they are getting replaced. There is an encroachment, like the seawater actually starts taking the place, because there is no fresh water. The saline water actually takes the place. So this is almost everywhere in almost all coastal areas.
In Chennai also, there's this ingress of seawater into the groundwater well.
Yes, that's true. Chennai
Houston
is
also another cursed city, right? Houston is also a cursed city. They say that.
Yes.
And one more question connected to this. They also say that the bridges, the flyovers and everything, they also break because of the same reason. So what could be the reason again?
So again, because whenever we put any piers or pillars for any bridges, they do test the strength of the rock. And now, over the time, the water which has been basically holding that crevice or that space, now they are empty. So then they start settling into these crevices or these open cavities. So then the pillars which are above, they will eventually break.
So can this problem be solved with a better infiltration techniques?
I think, like for example, I know in Saudi Arabia, because they're using this some kind of fire system which they built in sand. So it is something like multiple tubes that they use in sandy areas, so that it gives a proper foundation. It is not like the ones which we use, like we dig, say, 5 meters down and then we put a base of concrete. So there are different methods for different regions, and surely can be adopted. But to be honest, if the sea is encroaching because of sea level rise, I don't know how safe it is to live there for long.
Yeah, that's right. They are shifting the city, right? Jakarta, they are shifting some. So they have a plan by 2024, they will be shifting. Anyway, thanks for the answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Welcome.
The next question is from Mukta to Varsha ma'am. Is Mukta here?
Yeah, I'm very much here. Hello, Varsha ma'am.
Hello.
Yeah, you said that about a living pond system. So how is it different from it is definitely not the pond that is lined by HDB plastic sheet, right? So can you talk more about this living pond that you're talking about, that the image also you showed?
Yeah, so basically, so if you remember initially in most of the designs, what we used to have, or we still have in many designs, what we have is water bodies that are fully constructed without too much of interaction with the surrounding landscape, So here, when we are talking about living pond, we are not dependent totally on a system for maintaining the water quality, or through recirculation, or through by adding oxygen or anything. So it has its own system. It is which takes time. When you make it anything that you create, I think it takes time to establish itself. So the system establishes over a very long time. So there are many ways of doing it. One is, as you said, without liner or without concrete base. But I think one is about totally built this, in which also you can introduce life. That is not a full or absolutely foolproof way of creating pond, but it is an intermediate step, because generally people think that living ponds, they do not need any maintenance. But when you build such a pond, initially for first year there is a lot of input that is required, in terms of managing invasive, in terms of managing growth, maintaining the surface area of water, I mean the ratio of water with plant surface area. So things, I think initially you have to take some effort doing that. So to be honest, currently what we are doing is we are doing it with the built base, but the edges are much softer. So edges, actually it is through the edges that we kind of initiate interaction with plants and create habitats on the sides and things like that.
Okay. Nice to hear that. Thanks.
The next question is from Guna Nathani. Is Guna here?
Yeah. Hello, sir.
That's the question.
My question is that in most of the cities like Chennai, like my thesis is on Chennai, where the water quality, the groundwater quality is already polluted due to the seepage from polluted water bodies, the surface water bodies. So is there any way to revive the quality of such groundwater?
Surely, I mean, there is definitely there is a possibility to revive, improve the quality. But I think if you ask me, in say Chennai, just 2 or 3 households will not make a difference. It has to be entire city, and there has to be some kind of a legal push also for doing water harvesting. Because I've seen in Bangalore, I forgot the name of the individual, but he's doing quite impressive work where he's reviving all those old wells, and also trying to recharge surface runoff from the roofs of urban societies. I think it has to be a collective effort. 1, 2, or 3 recharge efforts won't do. And also, if you put up any pond or anything, it will only help in and around that pond. It has to be a collective effort. That's what I would feel that would revive the entire groundwater region. For that reason.
Okay, sir. Okay, thank you.
It was a wonderful presentation, both of the speakers. You may not have seen the comments, but it was really lovely. So thank you for being here, all the guests. Thank you for your patience. And Shruti, let's find out.
Yes. Thank you, Prachi. And as Prachi rightly said, less the spoken by any next person, the better today, because we have a lot of things to kind of seep in. What a wonderful day, and what a wonderful session we had. Amazing. We were talking about the same basic element as water, but we had so much of diversity about the topics around it. So it was wonderful. Rennie, thank you so much for all the knowledge that you have shared with us today. It was amazing to understand through your lens what water is like. And Varsha ma'am, your presentation was fabulous. You have through your presentation you have touched so many qualities and so many amazing qualities the water has. So it's a circulation for all of us young landscape architects to, look at water differently. So thank you so much, ma'am. And looking at all the comments that have come for your presentation, it's an honor to have you today. Thank you so much. Thank you, Prachi, for moderating today's event. I also have to thank Anupama for all the wonderful posters she has been making for us throughout the event. And last but not the least, I think the whole ISOLA team of Maharashtra chapter has really worked hard for all of this. So a pat of thanks to all of us as well. And last but not the least, today we had 110 people being part of today's event as participants. Thank you, each one of you, to come and spend your Saturday morning. And it's a big encouragement for us. Thank you so much, all of you.